Chapter 10. The soft patter of rain and the voices of men singing outside the hut woke me from my afternoon nap. Shadows began to lengthen, and the wind played with the palm fronds hanging over the roofs. Sounds and presences filled the huts all at once. Fires were stoked. Soon everything smelled of smoke, of dampness, of food and wet dogs. There were men chanting outside, oblivious to the drops pecking at their backs, at their mask-like faces. Their eyes, watery from the apina, were fixed on the distant clouds, open wide to the spirits of the forest. I walked out into the rain to the river. The heavy drops drumming on the ceiba leaves awakened the tiny frogs hiding under the tall grass blades that grew along the bank. I sat down at the edge of the water. Unaware of time passing, I watched the concentric circles of rain spreading over the river, pink flowers drifting by like forsaken dreams of another place. The sky darkened. The outline of the clouds began to blur as they merged into each other. The trees turned into a single mass. Leaves lost their distinctive shapes, becoming indistinguishable from the evening sky. I heard a whimpering sound behind me. I turned around, but saw only the faintest gleam of rain on the leaves. Seized by an inexplicable apprehension, I ascended the trail leading to the Shabono. At night, I was never sure of anything. The river, the forest were like presences. I could only feel, but never understand. I slipped on the muddy path, stubbing my toe on a gnarled root. Once more I heard a soft whimpering sound. It reminded me of the mournful cries of Ira Mamoe's hunting dog, which he had shot in a fit of rage with a poisoned arrow during a hunt when the animal had barked inopportunely. The injured dog had returned to the settlement and hid outside the wooden palisade, where it had whined for hours until Arasue put an end to its suffering with another arrow. I called softly. The cry stopped, and then I distinctly heard an agonized moan. Maybe it's true that there are forest spirits, I thought, straightening up. The Itikoteri claimed that there were beings who cross a tenuous boundary that separates animal from men. These creatures call the Indians at night, luring them to their deaths. I stifled a cry. It seemed as if a shape loomed from the dark, some concealed figure that moved among the trees only a pace from where I stood. I sat down again in an effort to conceal myself. I heard a faint breathing. It was more like a sighing, accompanied by a rattling, choking sound. Through my head rushed the stories of revenge, of bloody raids the men were so fond of talking about at night. In particular, I remembered the story about Angelica's brother, the old shaman, Puriwariwe, who supposedly had been killed in a raid, yet had not died. He was shot in the stomach where death hides, Arasui had once said one evening. He didn't lie down in his hammock, but remained standing in the middle of the clearing, leaning on his bow and arrow. He swayed, but didn't fall. The raiders remained rooted on the spot, unable to shoot another arrow, as the old man chanted to the spirits. With the arrow still stuck in the spot where death lies, he disappeared into the forest. He was gone for many days and nights. He lived in the darkness of the forest, without food or drink. He chanted to the hikuras of animals and trees, creatures that are harmless in the clear light of the day, but in the shadows of the night they cause terror to the one who cannot command them. From his hiding place, the old Shapori lured his enemies. He killed them one by one with magical arrows. Again, I heard the whimpering sound, then a choking noise. I crawled, carefully feeling for thorns in the undergrowth. I gasped in terror as I touched a hand. Its fingers were curled around a broken bow. I did not recognize the sprawled out body until I touched Kamosiwe's scarred face. "Old man," I called, afraid that he was dead. He turned on his side, pulled his legs up with the ease of a child that seeks warmth and comfort. He tried to focus with his single, deeply set eye as he looked at me helplessly. It was as though he were returning from a great distance, from another world. Steadying himself against a broken bow, he tried to get on his feet. He clutched my arm, then let out an eerie sound as he sank to the ground. I could not hold him up. I shook him, but he lay still. I felt for his heartbeat to see if he was dead. Kamosiwe opened his one eye. His gaze seemed to hold a silent plea. The dilated pupil reflected no light. Like a deep, dark tunnel, it seemed to draw the strength out of my body. Afraid I would make a mistake, I talked to him in Spanish, softly, as if he were a child. I hoped he would close that awesome eye and fall asleep. Lifting him by the armpits, I dragged him toward the Shabono. Although he was only skin and bones, his body seemed to weigh a ton. After a few minutes, I had to sit and rest, wondering if he was still alive. His lips trembled. He spat out his tobacco quid. The dark saliva dribbled over my leg. His eye filled with tears. I put the wad back into his mouth, but he refused it. I took his hands, rubbed them against my body so as to imbue them with some warmth. He started to say something, but I heard only an unintelligible mutter. One of the young boys who slept close to the entrance next to the old man's hut helped me lift Kamosiwe into his hammock. "Put logs on the fire," I said to one of the gaping boys, "and call Arasue, Itiwa, or someone who can help the old man." Kamosiwe opened his mouth to ease his breathing. The wavering light of the small fire accentuated his ghost-like paleness. His face twisted into an odd smile, a grimace that reassured me I had done the right thing. The hut filled with people. Their eyes shone with tears. Their sorrowful wails spread throughout the Shabono. "Death is not like the darkness of night," Kamosiwe said in a barely audible whisper. His words fell into silence as the people gathered around his hammock momentarily stopped their laments. "Do not leave us alone," the men moaned as they burst into loud weeping. They began to talk about the old man's courage, about the enemies he had killed, about his children, about the days he was the head man of the Itikoteri, and the prosperity and glory he had brought to the settlement. "I will not die yet." The old man's words silenced them once again. "Your weeping makes me too sad." He opened his eye and scanned the faces around him. "The hikuras are still in my chest. Chant to them, for they are the ones who keep me alive." Arasue, Iramamowe, and 4 other men blew a pina into each other's nostrils. With blurred eyes, they began to sing to the spirits dwelling below and above the earth. "What ails you?" Arasue asked after a while, bending over the old man. His strong hands massaged the weak, withered chest. His lips blew warmth into the immobile form. I'm only sad, Kamosiwe whispered. The Hikuras will soon abandon my chest. It's my sadness that makes me weak. I returned with Ritimi to our hut. He will not die, she said, wiping the tears from her face. I don't know why he wants to live so long. He is old. He is no longer a man. What is he? His face, she said, has become so small, so thin. Ritimi looked at me as if at a loss for words to express her thoughts. She made a vague gesture with her hand, as if grasping for something she did not know how to voice. Shrugging, she smiled. The men will chant throughout the night, and the Hikuras will keep the old man alive. A monotonous rain, warm and persistent, mingled with the men's songs. Whenever I sat up in my hammock, I could see them across the clearing in Kamosiwe's hut, crouched in front of the fire. They chanted with a compelling force, convinced that their invocations could preserve life as the rest of the Itikoteri slept. The voices faded with the rosy melancholy of dawn. I got up and walked across the clearing. The air was chilly, the ground damp from the rain. The fire had died down, yet the hut was warm from the misty smoke. The men huddled together, still crouched under Kamosiwe. Their faces were drawn, their eyes were hollowed by deep circles. I returned to my hammock as Ritimi was getting up to rekindle the fire. Kamosiwe seems well, I said, lying down to sleep. As I stood up from behind a bush, I saw Arasue's youngest wife and her mother slowly pushing their way through the thicket in the direction of the river. Quietly, I followed the two women. They had no baskets with them, only a piece of sharpened bamboo. The pregnant woman held her hands to her belly as if supporting its heavy weight. They stopped under an arapuri tree where the undergrowth had been cleared and broad platanilo leaves had been scattered on the ground. The pregnant woman knelt on the leaves, pressing her abdomen with both hands. A soft moan escaped her lips, and she gave birth. I held my hand over my mouth to stifle a giggle. I could not conceive that giving birth could be so effortless, so fast. The two women talked in whispers, but neither one of them looked at or picked up the shiny wet infant on the leaves. With a bamboo knife, the old woman cut the umbilical cord, then looked around until she found a straight branch. I watched her place the stick across the baby's neck, then step with both feet at either end. There was a faint snapping sound. I was not sure if it was the baby's neck or if it was the branch that had cracked. The afterbirth they wrapped in one bundle of platanilo leaves, the small lifeless body into another. They tied the bundles with vines and placed them under the tree. I tried to hide behind the bushes as the women got up to leave, but my legs would not obey me. I felt drained of all emotion, as if the scene in front of me were some bizarre nightmare. The women looked at me. A faint flicker of surprise registered on their faces, but I saw no pain or regret in their eyes. As soon as they were gone, I untied the vines. The lifeless body of a baby girl lay on the leaves, as if in sleep. Long black hair, like silk strands, stuck to her slippery head. The lashless lids were swollen, covering the closed eyes. The trickle of blood running from nose and mouth had dried, like some macabre Onoto design on the faint purplish skin. I pried open the small fists. I checked the toes to see if they were complete. I found no visible deformity. The late afternoon had spent itself. The dried leaves made no rustling sound under my bare feet. They were damp with the night. The wind parted the leafy branches of the cebas. Thousands of eyes seemed to be staring at me. Indifferent eyes, veiled in green shadows. I walked down the river and sat on a fallen log that had not yet died. I touched the clusters of new shoots that desperately wanted to see the light. The cricket's call seemed to mock my tears. I could smell the smoke from the huts, and I resented those fires that burned day and night, swallowing time and events. Black clouds hid the moon, cloaking the river in a veil of mourning. I listened to the animals, those that wake from their day's sleep and roam the forest at night. I was not afraid. A silence, like a soft dust from the stars, fell around me. I wanted to fall asleep and wake up, knowing it had all been a dream. Through a patch of clear sky, I saw a shooting star. I could not help smiling. I had always been fast to make a wish, but I could not think of any. I felt Ritimi's arm around my neck. Like some forest spirit, she had sat down noiselessly beside me. The pale sticks at the corner of her mouth shone in the dark, as if they were made of gold. I was grateful she was near me, that she did not say a word. The wind brushed away the clouds that obscured the moon. Its light covered us in a faint blue. Only then did I notice old Kamosiwe squatting beside the log, his eye fixed on me. He began to talk, slowly, enunciating each word. But I was not listening. Leaning heavily on his bow, he motioned us to follow him to the Shabono. He stopped by his hut. Ritimi and I walked onto ours. Only a week ago, women and men cried, I said, sitting in my hammock. They cried believing Kamosiwe was going to die. Today I saw Arasue's wife kill her newborn child. Ritimi handed me some water. How could the woman feed a new baby at her breast when she has a child that still suckles? She said briskly. A child who has lived this long. Intellectually, I grasped Ritimi's words. I was aware that infanticide was a common practice among Amazonian Indians. Children were spaced approximately 2 to 3 years apart. The mother lactated during this time and refrained from bearing another child in order to sustain an ample supply of milk. If a deformed or female child were born during this time, it was killed, so as to give the nursing child a better chance of survival. Emotionally, however, I was unable to accept it. Ritimi held my face, forcing me to look at her. Her eyes shone, her lips trembled with feeling. The one who has not yet glimpsed at the sky has to return from where it came. She stretched her arm toward the immense black shadows that began at our feet and ended in the sky, to the house of thunder. Chapter 11. Instead of the women's soft chattering, I was awakened one morning by Iramamoe's shouts announcing that he would prepare curare that day. I sat up in my hammock. Iramamoe stood in the middle of the clearing, legs apart, arms folded over his chest. He scrutinized the young men who had gathered around him. At the top of his voice, he warned them that if they planned to help him prepare the poison, they were not to sleep with a woman that day. Iramamoe went on ranting, as if the men had already misbehaved, reminding them that he would know if they disobeyed him, for he would test the poison on a monkey. Should the animal survive, he would never again ask the men to assist him. He told them that if they wished to accompany him into the forest to collect the various vines needed to make the mamukori, they had to refrain from eating and drinking until the poison had been smeared on their arrowheads. Calm returned to the Shabono as soon as the men left. Tutemi, after stoking the fires, rolled the tobacco quids for herself, Ritimi, and Ituwa, then returned to her hammock. I thought there was time to snatch a bit more sleep before the plantains buried under the embers were done. I turned over in my hammock. The smoke warmed the chilly air. As they did every morning after relieving themselves, little Tishoma and Sisiwe, as well as Arasue's two youngest children, climbed into my hammock and snuggled up to me. Ritimi had been oblivious to the morning events. She was still sound asleep on the ground. Sleep did not interfere with Ritimi's vanity. Her head, resting on her arm, was propped in such a manner that it allowed her to wear her full beauty regalia. Slender polished rods were stuck through the septum of her nose and the corners of her mouth. Her exposed cheek revealed two brown lines, a sign recognizable by everyone in the Shabono that she was menstruating. For the last 2 nights, Ritimi had not slept in her hammock, had not eaten meat, had not cooked any of the meals, and had not touched Ituwa or any of his belongings. Men feared menstruating women. Ritimi had told me that women were known not to have hikuras in their chest, but were linked to the life essence of the otter, the ancestor of the first woman on earth. During their menses, women were thought to be imbued with the supernatural powers of the otter. She did not seem to know what these powers were, but she said that if a man saw an otter in the river, he never killed it for fear that a woman in the settlement would die that same instant. The Itikoteri women had at first been puzzled as to why I had not menstruated since my arrival. My explanation, loss of weight, change of diet, new surroundings, was not thought to be the reason. Instead, they believed that as a non-Indian, I was not fully human. I had no link to the life essence of any animal, plant, or spirit. It was only Ritimi who wanted to believe and prove to the other women that I was human. You have to tell me immediately when you are Ru, as if I were your mother. Ritimi would say to me every time she herself menstruated, and I will make the proper preparations so you will not be turned into a stone by the tiny creatures that live underground. Richimi's insistence was probably another reason my body did not follow its normal cycles. Since I have a tendency to suffer from claustrophobia, I had periodic attacks of anxiety, triggered by the possibility of having to endure the same restrictions that an Itikoteri girl going through her first menses does. Only a week before, Shatomi, one of the headman's daughters, had emerged from a 3-week confinement. Her mother, upon learning that Shatomi had begun her first period, built an enclosure made out of sticks, palm fronds, and vines in a corner of their hut. A narrow space had been left open. It was barely large enough for her mother to slip in and out of twice a day to feed the meager fire inside, which was never allowed to die, and remove the soiled platanilo leaves covering the ground. The men, afraid of dying young or of becoming ill, did not so much as glance toward that area in the hut. For the first 3 days of her menstrual period, Shatomi was only given water and had to sleep on the ground. Thereafter, she was given 3 small plantains a day and was permitted to rest in the small bark hammock that was hung inside. She was not allowed to speak or weep during her confinement. All I heard from behind the tied palm fronds was the faint sound of Shatomi scratching herself with a stick, for she was not supposed to touch her body. By the end of the 3rd week, Shatomi's mother dismantled the enclosure, tied the palm leaves into a tight bundle, then asked some of her daughter's playmates to hide them in the forest. Shatomi did not move, as if the palm fronds were still around her. She remained crouched on the ground with downcast eyes. Her slightly hunched shoulders seemed so frail that I was sure if someone grasped them, the bones would give way with a hollow crack. More than ever, she looked like a frightened child, thin and dirty. "Keep your eyes on the ground," her mother said, helping the 12, perhaps 13-year-old girl to her feet. With her arms around her waist, she led Shatomi to the hearth. "Don't rest your eyes on any of the men in the clearing," she admonished the girl, "lest you want their legs to tremble when they have to climb trees." Water had been heated. Lovingly, Richimi washed her half-sister from head to foot, then rubbed her body with onoto until it glowed uniformly red. Fresh banana leaves were placed on the fire as Richimi guided the girl around the hearth. Only after Shatomi's skin smelled of nothing but burnt leaves was she allowed to look at us and speak. She bit her lower lip as she slowly lifted her head. "Mother, I don't want to move out of my father's hut," she finally said, then burst into tears. "Oh, you silly child," the mother exclaimed, taking Shatomi's face into her hands. Brushing aside the tears, the woman reminded the girl how lucky she was to become the wife of Hayama's youngest son, Matue, that she was fortunate to be so close to her brothers who would protect her should he mistreat her. The mother's dark eyes glittered, blurred with tears. I had reasons to be heavy-hearted when I first came to this Shabono. I had left my mother and brothers behind. I had no one to protect me. Tutemi embraced the young girl. "Look at me. I also came from far away, but now I'm happy. I will soon have a child." "But I don't want a child," Shatomi sobbed. "I only want to hold my pet monkey." In a swift impulse, I reached for the monkey perched on a cluster of bananas and handed it to Shitomi. The women burst into giggles. "If you treat your husband right, he'll be like your pet monkey," one of them said in between fits of laughter. "Don't say such things to the girl," old Hayama said, reprovingly. Smiling, she faced Shitomi. "My son is a good man," she said soothingly. "You'll have nothing to fear." Hayama went on praising her son, stressing Matue's prowess as a hunter and provider. The day of the wedding, Shitomi sobbed quietly. Hayama came to her side. "Don't cry anymore. We will adorn you. You'll be so beautiful today. Everyone will gasp in wonder." She took Shitomi's hand, then motioned the women to follow them through a side exit into the forest. Sitting on a tree stump, Shitomi wiped her tears with the back of her hand. A whimsical smile appeared on her lips as she gazed into old Hayama's face. Then she readily submitted to the women's ministrations. Her hair was cut short, her tonsure shaven. Tufts of soft white feathers were pushed through her perforated earlobes. They contrasted sharply with her black hair, adding an ethereal beauty to her thin face. The holes at the corner of her mouth and lower lip were decorated with red macaw feathers. Through the perforated septum in her nose, Ritimi inserted an almost white, very slender, polished stick. "How lovely you look," we exclaimed as Shitomi stood in front of us. "Mother, I'm ready to go," she said solemnly. Her dark slanted eyes shone. Her skin looked flushed with the anoto. She smiled briefly, revealing strong, even white teeth, then led the way back to the Shabono. Only for an instant, just before entering the clearing, was there a silent plea in her eyes as she turned to look at her mother. Her head held high, her gaze focused on no one in particular. Shitomi slowly circled the clearing, seemingly unperturbed by the admiring words and glances of the men. She entered her father's hut and sat in front of the trough filled with plantain pap. First, she offered some of the soup to Arasue, then to her uncles, her brothers, and finally to each man in the Shabono. After she had served the women, she walked toward Hayama's hut, sat down in one of the hammocks, and began to eat the game prepared by her husband, to whom she had been promised before she had been born. Tutami's words cut into my reveries. "Are you going to eat your plantain here or at Hayama's?" "I better eat there," I said, grinning at Ritimi's grandmother, who was already waiting for me in the hut next to Tutami's. Shitomi smiled at me as I came over. She had changed a great deal. It had nothing to do with the weight she had gained back since emerging from her confinement. Rather, it was her mature behavior, the way she looked at me, the way she urged me to eat the plantain. I wondered if it was because girls, as opposed to boys, who were able to prolong their childhood into their teens, were encouraged by the time they were 6 or 8 to help their mothers with the domestic chores, gathering wood, weeding in the gardens, taking care of the younger siblings. By the time a boy was considered an adult, a girl of the same age was married and often the mother of a child or 2. After eating, Tutemi, Shatomi, and I worked for several hours in the gardens, then walked into the Shabono, refreshed from our baths in the river. A group of men, their faces and bodies painted black, sat together in the clearing. Some were scraping the bark off thick pieces of branches. "Who are these people?" I asked. "Don't you recognize them?" Tutemi laughed at me. "It's Iramamoe and the men who went with him yesterday into the forest." "Why are they painted black?" "Iramamoe!" Tutemi shouted. "The white girl wants to know, why are your faces all black?" She asked, then ran into her hut. "It's good you are running," Iramamoe said, standing up. "The baby in your womb might weaken the mamu kori by adding water." Frowning, he turned to Shatomi and me. Before he had a chance to say anything else, Shatomi pulled me by the hand into Itiwa's hut. In between fits of laughter, Shatomi explained that anyone who had been in the water that day was not supposed to come close to the men preparing curare. Water was believed to weaken the poison. If the mamu kori doesn't work right, he will blame you. "I would have liked to watch them prepare the mamu kori," I said disappointedly. "Who would want to watch anything like that?" Richimi said, sitting up. "I can tell you what they are going to do." She yawned and stretched, then folded the platanillo leaves she had been sleeping on and covered the ground with fresh ones. "The men are painted black because mamakori is not only useful for hunting, but also for making war," Ritimi said, motioning me to sit next to her. She peeled a banana, then with a full mouth explained how the men were boiling the mamukori vine until it turned into a dark liquid. Later, the dried ashukamaki vine would be added to thicken the poison. Once the mixture had been boiled down, it would be ready to be brushed on the men's arrowheads. Resignedly, I helped Tutemi prepare the tobacco leaves for drying. Following her precise instructions, I split each leaf along the nervation, pulling upward so they bundled up, then tied them in bunches on the rafters. From where I sat, I was unable to see what was going on outside Iramamoe's hut. Children surrounded the working men, hoping to be asked to help. No wonder I had not seen a single child that morning bathing in the river. "Get some water from the stream," Iramamoe said to little Sisiwe. "But don't get your feet wet. Step on trunks, roots, or stones. If you get wet, I'll have to send someone else." It was late afternoon when Iramamoe was almost finished mixing and boiling the curare. Now the mamukori is becoming strong. I can feel my hands going to sleep. In a slow, monotonous voice, he began to chant to the spirits of the poison as he stirred the curare. Around mid-morning the following day, Iramamoe came running into the Shabono. "The mamukori is useless. I shot a monkey, but it didn't die. It walked away with the useless arrow stuck in its leg." Iramamoe ran from hut to hut, insulting the men who had helped him prepare the curare. "Didn't I warn you not to sleep with women? Now the mamukori is worthless. If an enemy should attack us, you won't even be able to defend your women. You think you are brave warriors, but you are as useless as your arrows. You should be carrying baskets instead of weapons. For a moment, I thought Iramamoe was going to cry as he sat on the ground in the middle of the clearing. I'll make the poison myself, by myself. You are all incompetent. He muttered over and over until his anger was spent, until he was thoroughly exhausted. A few days later at dawn, shortly before the monkey Iramamoe had shot with his newly poisoned arrow was fully cooked, a stranger walked into the Shabono, carrying a large bundle. His hair was still wet from a river bath. His face and body were extravagantly painted with onoto. Placing his bundle, as well as his bow and arrows, on the ground, he stood silently in the middle of the clearing for a few minutes before he approached Arasue's hut. I've come to invite you to my people's feast, the man said in a loud, sing-song voice. The head man of the Mokototeri had sent me to tell you that we have many ripe plantains. Arasue, without getting up from his hammock, told the man that he could not attend the feast. I cannot leave my gardens now. I planted new banana saplings. They need my care. Arasue made a sweeping gesture with his hand. Look at all the fruit hanging from the rafters. I don't want them to spoil. The visitor walked over to our hut and addressed Itua. Your father-in-law doesn't wish to come. I hope you will be able to visit my people who have sent me to invite you. Itua slapped his thighs with pleasure. Yes, I'll come. I don't mind leaving my plantains behind. I'll give others permission to eat them. The visitor's dark, lively eyes shone with delight as he went from hut to hut, inviting the Itikoteri to his settlement. The man was invited to rest in old Kamosiwe's hut. He was offered plantain soup and monkey meat. Later in the evening, he untied his bundle in the middle of the clearing. A hammock. The men who had gathered around him murmured disappointedly. Even though the Itikoteri acknowledged the comfort and warmth of cotton hammocks, only a few women owned one. The men preferred the bark or vine ones, replacing them periodically. The visitor was eager to trade the cotton hammock for poisoned arrowheads and ipina powder made from seeds. Talking and exchanging news, some Itikoteri men stayed up all night with the visitor. Arasue was adamant that I should not be part of the group going to the Mokototeri feast. Milagros has entrusted you to me, the head man reminded me. How can I protect you if you are at another place? What do I need to be protected for? I asked. Are the Mokototeri dangerous people? The Mokototeri are not to be trusted, Arasue said after a long silence. I can feel it in my legs that it is not right for you to go. When I first met Angelica, she told me that it was not dangerous for a woman to walk through the forest. Arasue did not bother to answer or comment on my statement, but looked at me as if I had become invisible. Obviously, he considered the matter settled and did not intend to demean himself by any further bantering with an ignorant girl. Maybe Milagros will be there, I said. Arasue smiled. Milagros will not be there. If he were, I would have no reason to worry. Why are the Mokototeri not to be trusted? I persisted. You ask too many questions, Arasue said. We are not on friendly terms with them, he said grudgingly. I looked at him in disbelief. Why then do they invite you to a feast? You are ignorant, Arasue said, walking out of the hut. It was not only I who was disillusioned by Arasue's decision. Ritimi was so disappointed she could not show me off to the Mokototeri that she enlisted Itua and Iramamoe, as well as old Kamosiwe, to help convince her father to let me accompany them. Although old people's advice was valued and respected, it was Iramamoe, known for his bravery, who finally persuaded and assured his brother that no harm would befall me at the Mokototeri settlement. You should take the bow and arrows I made for you, Arasue said to me later that evening. He began to laugh uproariously. That would certainly astonish the Mokototeri. It would almost be worth it for me to go and witness their surprise. Seeing that I was checking my arrows, Arasue added soberly, You cannot take them. It's not proper for a woman to walk through the forest carrying a man's weapon. I will take care of her, Ritimi promised her father. I'll make sure she never leaves my side, not even when she has to go into the bush. I'm sure Milagros would have wanted me to go, I said, hoping to make Arasue feel more at ease. Eyeing me gloomily, he shrugged his shoulders. I trust you will return safely. Anticipation and apprehension kept me awake that night. The familiar noises of the collapsing logs in the fire filled me with misgivings. Itua stirred the embers with a stick before lying down. Through the smoke and mist, the distant crowns of trees looked like ghosts. The space between the leaves were like hollow eyes, accusing me of something I did not understand. I was almost tempted to follow Arasue's advice, but the light of day dispelled my apprehension.